Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the First Unitarian Society of Milwaukee. I'm the Reverend Jim Fody, and I'm pleased to serve as your assistant sabbatical minister. Here at First Church, we welcome people of all genders, sexualities, ages, races, ethnicities, histories, and bodies. We welcome your mind, your heart, and your spirit. We welcome all you are carrying with you today and all that your heart longs to set down. We'd like to pay a special welcome to guests joining us this morning. If you are visiting today, we invite you to fill out a welcome card. These are located in the pew rack in front of you. You can fill them out and drop them in the offering plate later in the service. Please join us for a social hour after the service across the hall in the Leanhout's common room. It's right over there. Folks can find hearing assist devices and large print hymnals and orders of service in the back of the sanctuary, kind of near where you came in over there. We also have worship activity bags for children or those young at heart. A couple of announcements this morning. One is there's just to remind everyone that there will be no religious education classes or childcare available during either of our Sunday services today. We're doing this to offer a rare Sabbath and weekend off for our part-time religious education staff and volunteers. Families are always welcome here in the sanctuary, and we do have those activity bags. And families are also welcome to use the parlor, which is the room on the other side of this wall. That room has audio of the service, so you can listen to the service there. Thank you for your understanding. And next week on June 4th, Sunday, June 4th, we hope you will join us from 1 to 3 p.m. for the First Church picnic at the Kern Park Pavilion. Everyone should bring their own lunch and drinks, and we will supply the fun. There are picnic tables, accessible bathrooms, and an indoor shelter with a playground and a basketball court. There's a basketball court nearby. More details are available printed in your order of service. We hope to see many of you there. I now welcome you to our worship service by inviting you to join me in a unison affirmation of our mission. The words are printed on your order of service. We gather to nurture the spirit, engage the mind, and inspire action. And now it is my honor to introduce to you the Reverend Hannah Roberts Villeneuve. Reverend Hannah serves as the assistant minister at the Fox Valley UU Fellowship in Appleton, Wisconsin. Prior to that, she served as the minister of the UU Church in Cheyenne, Wyoming. Before the jaunt westward, Hannah lived in Baltimore, where she fell in love with crab cakes, Orioles baseball, and her wife, Catherine. They live in Appleton with their two kiddos, Ada and Benjamin. And Reverend Hannah is no stranger to southeastern Wisconsin. She grew up in Racine at the Olympia Brown UU Church. Please join me in giving a warm welcome to the Reverend Hannah Roberts Villeneuve.
Good morning. Thank you, Jim. Thank you all. We come to worship with these words. What a circle can contain, the reach of its round arms, is a function of the radius. The distance from the center to the margin, and a quirky little constant called pi. The constant knows just what to do, how to keep the integrity of the circle, how to ensure that no matter how far you extend the distance from the center to the edge, no matter how expansive the circle may become, it will remain a circle, perfect, whole. Indeed, the constant is defined by the circle. It is the very essence of the circle itself. The constant in our circle, there are many possible answers. You might earnestly say that it is reason, or suggest coffee with a wink. But the great constant, studied for thousands of years and yet unknowable in its fullness, taught to generations of dutiful students with increasing specificity of decimals and yet, in the end, a mystery, is love. In the spirit of contemplating love's mysteries, I invite you to rise in body or in spirit and join in singing hymn number 34 in the hardback gray hymnal, Though I May Speak with Bravest Fire. And invite you to hear this story from the Buddhist tradition. Once there was a king who came for his audience with Gautama Buddha. And like any royal preparing for their audience with a religious leader, the king decided he would bring a gift. And so he found the best gift, the most incredible gift. It was a beautiful ornament. It had sort of gold festooning. It had bright jewels. It was the best gift he could find. And so the day came for his audience with Buddha, and he came into the room and coming up for his audience with the Buddha. Felt like a great day to be king. And he held out his hand, presenting this beautiful, ornate, expensive gold ornament. And he held it forward, and Buddha looked him in the eyes and said, "Drop it." Well, that was not quite what the king had expected. But, how when the spirit says do, when the Buddha says drop it. And so the king dropped it. And he felt a little uncertain for a moment. But being a clever king, he had thought, maybe gold and jewels, maybe that's not Buddha's thing. Okay, I've got a backup gift, says the king. And from behind his back, in the other hand, he pulls out the most perfect flower. The most perfect flower you've ever seen. It has the leafiest leaves. It has the petaliest petals. They are pink and perfect. Nothing is out of place. It is the best flower the kingdom has ever seen. And he holds it out to give to Buddha. And Buddha looks at the flower and looks at the king and says, "Drop it." Well, that was not what the king had expected, but when the Buddha says drop it, you drop it. So he dropped it. Well, the king was running a little short on ideas now about what to present to Buddha in this important audience with his spiritual teacher. And so he thinks, how silly of me to think that I could present Buddha, who possesses all things, with things. That was silly of me. And so then the king decided that the next thing he would do is present himself. And so he just sort of put out his hands and waited. And the Buddha looked at the king, looked at his outstretched hands, and looked him in the eyes and said, "Drop it." Well, that was not what the king had expected. But he saw that in this moment, even to present himself, that was ego at work. And so he fell down prostrate on the floor. And Buddha looked at the king and said, "Ah, now you understand." As we contemplate this and the many stories of our lives, I invite you to rise in body or spirit and join us in singing hymn number 311, Let It Be a Dance. We'll sing verses 1 and 2. As we enter a time of meditation, we'll follow it with silence and then the seated singing of Spirit of Life. I invite you to settle in to this place, to this time, to this body that you indeed have. We all got one. And yours brought you here today. Feel maybe your shoulders drop away from your ears. There's so much more space there than we realize sometimes. Give thanks even for the crackle and pop. Get comfortable. Feel where you root to the earth, whether it be your feet or your seat. Relax. Be held. Perhaps close your eyes or soften your gaze and ground yourself here. Now. Spirit of life, holy everything, expanding beyond us and deep in our hearts, that which beats in the cells of our hearts and in the exploding stars beyond, carbon, oxygen, life. Feel it thrum beneath your feet on the earth. Feel it beat in your heart this day. Life. Feel it move from the very center of your being out to the very center of the universe, moving back and forth between the two. This morning, that which beats in our hearts reaches out as we mark Memorial Day tomorrow to honor those who have died in military service, that they and their families are held in the love that surpasses understanding, that which beats in our hearts reaches out and embraces all those impacted by war. The heart of who we are reaches out and holds in its embrace this day also all those fighting and struggling for a place where their gender is held, holy, whole, and beloved. Whether they fight in schools or school boards or state houses or homes, we hold them in our hearts this day. From the very center of our being, from the very center of the universe and back again, we hold those small griefs, the kind that don't make headlines, and yet can consume us. We hold these tender, unspoken, in our hearts. We hold to the joys, the beauty, and the possibility of life that never seems to make headlines either. The blessings of new life, the blessings of possibility, of a life and a universe unfolding from this moment, this day, this place, these people, this time. Held in this love, this possibility, this life, this universe, held in this love. We have no choice but to love in return. With grateful hearts, we say, Amen.
Good morning. My name is Patrick Mulvey, and I'm honored to be your worship associate for today. This reading is an excerpt from The Solace of Fierce Landscapes by Belden C. Lane. All of us know desert Christians who have never been to Egypt, never wandered the dry arroyos of southern Utah. but they have been no strangers to the most terrifying of desert landscapes. They have known intimately the parched and cracked land of an AIDS hospice, the steep cliffs beyond the waiting room of radiation oncology. Through their struggle with cancer and AIDS, they have acquired much of the attentiveness, explored many of the deep caves of indifference mapped out by desert Christians centuries before them. We know others who have frequented the bombed-out wastelands of the projects in inner-city neighborhoods, people who have trod the high country of abuse, poverty, or prejudice, dealing with levels of indifference for which we have no language. They dwell in the harsh desert of addiction and mental illness, knowing the sustained pain of unemployment, divorce, physical disability. The possibilities of desert experience in contemporary life are more varied than we can imagine. Certainly, a distinction has to be drawn here between voluntary and involuntary desert experience, between those who intentionally embrace the vulnerability of self-emptying and those inadvertently thrust into the dark night of body and soul. A crucial question of our time is how to provoke people into practicing the former while identifying in solidarity with those suffering the latter. In early monastic practice, the desert served a double function of comforting the afflicted as well as afflicting the comfortable. The desert as metaphor is that uncharted terrain beyond the edges of the seemingly secure and structured world in which we take such confidence, a world of affluence and order we cannot imagine ever ending. Yet it does. And at the point where the world begins to crack, where brokenness and disorientation suddenly overtake us, there we step into the wide, silent plains of a desert we had never known existed. We cross its sands, unwelcomed, stripped of influence and reputation, the desert caring nothing for the worries and warped self of self-importance dragged along behind us. There in the desert, everything is lost. Absolutely everything. The extent of its unrelenting indifference is devastating. This awareness at first is terrifying, but if we stay long enough, resisting the blind panic that gnaws at our minds, we discover, beyond hope and all caring, that in the end, we're saved by the things that ignore us. The deepest mystery of love is never realized apart from the experience of having nothing to offer in return. Only there does love reveal itself in unaccountable wonder.
If I told you that real love knew no boundaries, you might report me to your therapist. You would be right to do so. Because the kind of love that we sometimes talk about with our therapists or that we do interpersonally, that's the stuff that we do need to have boundaries around, where some sense of where I end and you begin is critical to how we interact with one another and our world. But Unitarian Universalists love to throw the word love around. And sometimes it's like those other four-letter words that when you use it too much, it loses its meaning, loses its punch. And so I think it's important that we are clear what kind of love we're talking about, because I want to talk today about a kind of love that indeed does not have boundaries, cannot have boundaries, cannot have limits. But it's not that kind of love like that you talk about with your family and your partner and your therapist and all that. So don't report me to your therapist. And as Unitarian Universalists, we do talk about love a lot. It's the whole slogan of our sort of justice campaign at the Unitarian Universalist Association called Side with Love. Thank you for wearing one of the yellow shirts. You don't know you're a plant, but you totally are. Right? We have the yellow shirts that we sometimes wear to justice functions. We're the love people, which, I feel like the love people is not exactly the branding I would personally choose, but you got to go with what you got, and it's what we got. And when we talk about that kind of love, that surpassing love, that all-encompassing love, part of what we mean is widening our circle, right? Of taking the circle of who has privilege, who has choice, who has possibility, and we want to expand it, we want to widen it, make it bigger, draw the circle wide even. But it's funny, this word love, that we have such a fondness for, that putting that at the center of what we do as Unitarian Universalists is not as simple or easy or inevitable as we sometimes think it is. So, at the Unitarian Universalist Association level, right, at the big macro, all-encompassing level, the UUA is undergoing a process to rewrite Article 2 of its bylaws, which perhaps does not sound as spicy or exciting as you might like. But it is spicy, I assure you, because Article 2 of the UUA's bylaws is the one place we have written down in official documentation the 7 principles of Unitarian Universalism, our set of promises about how we want to be together in religious community. And that section is undergoing a rewrite and is up for a vote at this summer's General Assembly. And part of the revision is that both in a sort of visual representational sense and in a theological sense, that the rewrite puts love at the center. It puts love at the center of who we are, who we purport to be as religious people, as Unitarian Universalists. And it's funny, our affinity for the word love, because you know what word never appears in the 7 principles? Love. Good. You're excellent plants here at the 11 o'clock service. 5 stars. Love doesn't appear in the language we have now to describe how we gather as people of faith. And yet, I think most of us, many of us, and certainly those surveyed by the Articles 2 Study Commission that helped draft this language, heard that over and over and over again from Unitarian Universalists, that this was core to who we are, how we understand ourselves, how we understand our congregations and communities, and how we understand how we interface with the wider world. Love is at the center. But a funny thing about putting love at the center is that we think of it in such sort of joyful terms, right? Love is at the center, like, won't that be nice? Won't that be great? Won't that be such a warm, fuzzy experience? Except that putting love at the center means that there is something else that cannot be at the center when love is there. And it's the thing we like to put at the center best. It's our greatest skill, I think, as human beings. What do we typically enjoy putting at the center? Me. I. Ego. Our own sense of specialness. We put that at the center all the time. Even when we think we're not, even when we think we're better than that or more enlightened than that, my goodness, we are excellent at putting ourselves at the center. And so putting love at the center means that somehow I, me, ego has to move out of the way. And that's hard enough to do as an individual. You could ask any of the many monks or nuns from a variety of religious traditions, right, who Belden Lane talked about in the reading. Those people who go out into the desert and meditate for months on end. It's hard enough to do it when you're just one person, but man, is it even harder when you have to do it with other people? Because human beings are sort of like love. They're really great in theory. And then you actually have to, do it. You have to actually be in community with other people, and you start to wonder if this human community thing is all it's cracked up to be. Widening our circle and putting love at the center of it means that ego has to find a way out. Or sometimes I think of it, it's about getting out of our own way. How many of you have gotten in your own way? Right, the spiritual and emotional version of tripping over your own feet? Yes. As we consider this moving out of the way of ego, we'll pause for one of my favorite stories of desert survival. Many of you perhaps know the writer Antoine de Saint-Exupéry as the author of The Little Prince. It's his best-known work, and it's in fact one of the best-known and most widely translated works of literature, and particularly works of children's literature across the globe. But in addition to being an author, Saint-Exupéry was a pilot, and he ran mail flights from between northern Africa and Europe throughout the 20s and 30s. And in the mid-30s, he was on a mail flight, right, in a plane whose safety features I think we can all imagine. Minimal at best. And his plane crash-landed over the Libyan desert. And in the plane with him, he had what, with all the love in my heart, I can only describe as a very French set of provisions. He had half a liter of white wine and 2 oranges. Not what I would choose to have with me when I crash-landed in the Libyan desert. I don't know about you. But that's what he had. And this is the sort of thing that for most human beings, a crash land in the middle of the desert is a death sentence, right? We don't make it out alive of that. But Saint-Exupéry had 2 things going for him. 2 ways that he interacted with that desert that made it possible for him to survive. The first was attentiveness, a deep and profound attention to the world around him that allowed him to notice sort of an unseasonable breeze that had just a little hint of moisture in it, and so he used his parachute to collect dew, which he then drank off of his parachute and sustained himself. A deep attention to the world around him. And the second practice that he used was indifference. Not indifference like the interpersonal indifference that we sometimes think of, but indifference in the sense of indifference to the reality of his circumstances. Right? Part of what happens when many people are stranded in the wilderness or other extreme conditions is that they panic, and it works against them. Think about people who are drowning and start flailing. And that's a very natural human response. I'm not standing up here saying like, I would never panic. Only fools would panic. No, we would all panic. It's a panic-worthy situation to be crash-landed in the middle of the desert, but he didn't panic. And that deep, grounded sense of calm allowed him to move slowly into this dewy breeze and eventually, a few days later, be picked up by a Bedouin caravan and live to tell this tale. When we are in life's deserts, how do we make it out? How do we make it out alive? We pay attention. And when all signs point to panic, we are indifferent. But actually being indifferent to panic in situations in life, whether they be actual literal desert strandings or the sorts of life's deserts that Belden Lane described in this morning's readings, requires moving that me, that I, that ego out of the center. Because if it's all about me, I'm gonna panic. But what becomes possible when I shift away from the center and make space in it for love? That sounds really nice, doesn't it? But the actual experience of doing that, anyone who has done it knows that that is not some sort of nice, blissful, sort of quiet, meditative experience. We sometimes picture folks who do that kind of desert spirituality practice, whether they do it in the literal desert or not, as sort of sitting on their cushions peacefully, reaching enlightenment. Doesn't that sound nice? Maybe you think of losing your ego as a glass being poured out, right? It's an emptying practice. Doesn't that sound nice? But anybody who's actually done it knows that it's not like having your ego poured out of a glass. It's like having the glass smashed with a hammer. That's what it really feels like. Anybody who has gotten in and then out of their own way knows that you cannot do it with your ego intact. You can't. But that it is this dismantling, this unraveling, this smashing into smithereens, that is what makes the space for love to be at the center. That is what makes space to encounter love in its fullness. in what Belden Lane describes so beautifully as unaccountable wonder. It's amazing what is possible, what we are capable of, whether individually or collectively, when we can get that me out of the way and let something more expansive than any of us take its place. It's the experience of profound interdependence, right? The profound sense that whatever happens to me affects you, affects our earth, affects each other. A profound sense that we are actually not that important and that life's deserts do not particularly care whether we make it across them alive or not. Right, which that's not a very warm, fuzzy, feel-good theology. But sometimes life is not particularly warm and fuzzy. And so we find a way through it. And a funny thing happens sometimes in our justice work as Unitarian Universalists, right? Our work to make the world a fairer, more better, more equitable place, which is that we want to do that kind of work that makes us feel good. Right? We want the warm fuzzies. But the reality is that the kind of social justice, the kind of ministry in that way that really changes lives is often neither warm nor fuzzy. So we're going to take a moment now to window shop another religious denomination's drama. I think of it as looking at the grass on the other side of the fence and remembering that it is not always greener. So I grew up Unitarian Universalist, but I went to a United Methodist seminary. And at the time, it was the beginnings of the controversy that is still, bless them, unfolding in the United Methodist Church around the full inclusion of LGBTQ people in the life of the church, both in terms of as lay leaders, as their capacity to get married in the church, and their capacity to serve as elders in full connection, which is basically Methodist for doing all the minister things. And their rule book, which they have, it's called the Book of Discipline, which sounds very fancy. I feel like the UUA, right, we don't even print it anymore. We just have a Word document of rules, which does not feel as fancy as a Book of Discipline, but I digress. So in the Book of Discipline, in the United Methodist tradition, the thing that you cannot be and be in full connection with the church is what's called, hilariously and marvelously, a self-avowed practicing homosexual, which I have always wanted on a business card. Don't you what do you do for work? Well, let me tell you. And that there was a song in the United Methodist circles around that time by gay composer Mark A. Miller called "Draw the Circle Wide." Right? Draw the circle wide, draw it wider still. No one stands alone, we stand side by side. And when you hear that song sometimes, divorced from that story, that moment, knowing that this song is a code of sorts for the full inclusion of LGBTQ people in the life of the United Methodist Church, you might think, doesn't that sound nice? They're going to draw that circle wide. Isn't that nice for them? But the truth is that in its context, that song, that act of drawing the circle wide, is hugely disruptive. Dangerous. People have lost their careers over it. Churches have split over it. Drawing the circle wide disrupts the circle that exists, right? It disrupts the sense of who's in and who's out. And most importantly, perhaps, it disrupts our sense that we are the ones drawing the circle in the first place. Because sure, we draw the circle of our congregation, of our local community, even at the denominational level. We are drawing a circle and trying to include more people at every turn, and yet, the big circle, at whose center is love, is not drawn by human hands. It's the promise of universalism, right? That all are in, no one is out. That there is a circle at whose center is love that you can never leave. And you can never exclude someone from. We draw this circle at whose center is love because it is our work to make our human communities full of us, blessed, bumbling, wonderful human beings such as we are. It is our work to make these circles reflect that larger circle as best we can. Goodness knows we get it wrong multiple times a day. But as the draft language from the UUA's new Article 2 proposal says, we are accountable to one another for doing the work of living our shared values through the spiritual discipline of love. Right? The spiritual discipline of love, like any discipline, it implies that you have to practice it. It's not some permanent state of things or some enlightenment that you reach and then never leave. It's a discipline, a practice, a choice. Because while that wider circle will always have love at the center, putting love at the center of our human circle, that takes work. That takes conscientious choice, because goodness knows, even when we are doing the best we can, that me, that I, that ego, right, it just creeps back into the middle. And that even the best and fanciest and most reverend among us, we do it too. Someone between services asked me, have you ever done it? Have you ever gotten your ego out of the center? And I said, once, like, through. We draw our circle wide not because we think it's the popular thing to do or the right thing to do or the politically expedient thing to do. We draw our circle wide and wider, holding love at the center, because we cut ourselves off if we fail to do it. We cut ourselves off from the fullness of human experience. I think we can all think of those moments in communities, whether this community or another one, where, my goodness, we have drawn the circle narrowly. We have drawn a circle with me at the center. And we've missed out. We draw the circle wide and scoot that ego out of the way as best we can at every turn, because that's the work. That's what it means to practice being human together. To be Unitarian Universalist, to put love at the center, to practice that discipline, day in, day out, again and again, failingly, haltingly, fumblingly, humanly. May love be at the center, this day and every day. May it be so. Amen.
Every week we have an opportunity to practice our values through sharing our resources. Our pledges are at the core of our spiritual practice of generosity. In addition, the church shares half of all the non-pledged cash in our offering plate with a community organization. In this way, we commit our resources in line with our belief that this congregation is interdependent with the world beyond these walls. Today, we share the plate with the Trevor Project, a national organization focused on suicide prevention for LGBTQ young people. You may contribute to the offering via cash, check, or texting. Details on these options are printed in your order of service. May the practice of giving bring us joy. The offering will now be gratefully received.
As we move forth from this time, this hour, this day, this place, may we have the capacity to pay attention, to experience the world around us in all of its fullness and possibility, and yet, for some degree of indifference, to know that in the grand scheme of things, they're not that important. May these things allow us to act in a deeper, more possible, more loving ways this day and every day. Go forth and do the work of blessing this world with love. In doing this work, know yourselves to be blessed. May it be so. Amen. I invite you now to rise in body or spirit and join us in singing hymn number 318 in the hardback gray hymnal, We Would Be One.